Our locomotive makeover continues. Decals, details, and more weathering coming up on JC's Riptrack. Hi there, my name is John and welcome to JC's Riptrack. If you're looking for advice and tips on how to transform your plastic models into something that you would see on the railways today, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. So as a follow-up to my last video, do you operate a short line on your model railroad? And if so, what sort of locomotive power do you use? Please let me know in the comment section down below. Now this video is the second part of a locomotive weathering project. We are transforming a Conrail GP15 locomotive into a leased unit that can be found operating on the Cape Breton Central Nova Scotia Railway today. Now if you haven't seen the first video, hit pause, follow that link, go and watch it, and then come back. Don't worry, I'll wait for you. So have you seen it? Good. So our starting point is this. We've just finished patching over the Conrail colors and painting the white stripe and handrails around the front and back of the locomotive. Now that the Conrail markings are covered up, it's time for our first round of decals. In this case, it is adding the road number and the road name to the area just underneath the cab window. As this is a lease unit, there's no fancy paint jobs or logos. This is a fairly simple scheme. However, as I discovered, the LLPX decal set that I got from Microscale did not have the right size of lettering for what I needed. In fact, all that I can use from the decal sheet is a small white road name LLPX. I had to get the white numbers from a sheet of basic sans serif alphanumeric sheet. I guess I will need to get a GP38-2 in order to use them. Now my method of applying decals is pretty straightforward, but it is with the goal of avoiding that silvering effect that can happen on decals if it's not applied properly. The first thing you need is a smooth surface. So I applied some brush-on acrylic gloss varnish to the areas where the decals were to go, and then I let it dry. In this case, I'm using Games Workshop's Ard Coat, but there's others that you can use as long as it provides a good, smooth surface. Once the varnish dried, I cut out the decals that I needed and kept them on the cutting mat. Using a paintbrush, I dabbed water on them and let them soak. I find this a better way to soak decals rather than immersing them in water. This works well as you're less likely to lose small decals in the water, especially if it separates from the backing paper, and two, you know exactly where each decal is. And while they were soaking, I brushed on a bit of Microset onto the glossy surface. So the secret to doing individual numbers is to apply all the decals that you need in a given area. In this case, 1504 and the LLPX sort of logo. Then I used a piece of paper towel to wick up some of the water, and then I used my number 11 blade to position the decals. Once they were in place, I carefully used the edge of the paper towel to pull out any extra water, and then double check their positions. At this point, I let the decals dry out before applying Microscale. I wanted to make sure that the decals wouldn't float out of position while soaking in the stuff that softens and dissolves the decal film. After applying the Microscale, I then let it dry again before brushing over the decals with some thinned down acrylic gloss varnish. And this helps seal it all in and also hides the decal film, and it will prevent silvering. Next up was a clear gloss coat followed by the dot fade technique that I described in the fading video. The oil colors I used were titanium white, Prussian blue, Starship Filth, and light rust. The reason I used the light rust color here is because the orange is a contrasting color to the blue of the model and would help desaturate some of the colors. This step would also combine well with the previous airbrush fade I did in the first video and would add some subtle variation to the surface of the model. As mentioned in the previous video, sometime between 2004 and 2010, the horn had migrated from being over the cab to a position behind the air intakes. I didn't re-drill any holes, but rather cut the pins flush and glued it to the top of the model with a small amount of superglue. I let the glue dry naturally before moving on to the next step. After this step, I airbrushed Tamiya flat clear over the model and I let it dry, and then I painted some of the smaller details. The exhaust stacks I painted using Privateer Press's Famar Black, and then used a bit of Games Workshop's White Scar to paint the edges of the stairs and to touch up some of the railings. I then used a bit of AK Interactive's chipping color to paint the chains and the front of the back of the handrails. The trick when doing some of these small details is to use a small brush, but don't use the brush tip. Instead, Brush off some of the paint on your palette and then use the edge of the brush along the edge of the detail parts you want. This trick works really well when you're trying to bring out the details like this. After another clear gloss coat using future floor polish, I went ahead with the pin washes. I tested a few different materials to see what would be best for the pin washes. I was thinking about using Ammo by MIG's Engine Grime enamel for this task, but after testing it, I decided that I would use it later for streaking and instead used my standby of Starship Filth as a homemade wash for this task. I wasn't disappointed. Using the method I outlined in the pin washes video, I dampened the surface of the model with odorless mineral spirits and then used a small brush to carefully apply the wash around the details and panel lines of the model. I then let it dry for a bit, and then came back with the larger brushes to either brush away or soften up the edges. This really made the details on the model pop out nicely. I would then let this dry for about 24 hours. At this point, I also attached aftermarket plows to the front and back of the locomotive. This is Canada. We need snowplows. I also enhanced the chipping effect of the models first with acrylic paints. The first was a very light blue called Blue Horror to account for some of the mottled light blue on the side of the locomotive. It was mostly applied with a very small brush, but I did do some light dabs with a sponge. Similarly, I used the standby of Mournfang Brown to work its magic on the rust chips. Mostly, I used a 000 brush to carefully paint the inside of a few of the larger chipped areas, or where it matched the prototype. Using the same method I outlined earlier in this video, I applied the tiny numeric decals to the lighted number boards, as well as the yellow sill stripes down the side of the lower part of the model. The technique is exactly the same. The sill stripes went on smoothly without issue. On the other hand, the numeric decals on the N-scale number boards can be an eye-crushing task. Earlier, I had prepared the number boards by scraping the original numbers off of it, by painting them white and then applying the same gloss coat. To apply the decals, I used head-mounted magnifiers at full strength to make this task easier, and often had to hold my breath as these decals were so small that even a small breath would send them flying to oblivion somewhere on my table. Even then, I elected to use a micron pen at a later point to paint the 1 on each number board. One tip for decals that I left out before: use a brand new number 11 blade for this job when the decals are that small. There are rust streaks on the prototype, but they are pretty small. Using the same method that I outlined in the tutorial video, but on a smaller scale, I used the Abteilung 502 light rust and dark rust to apply dots in appropriate places. In some cases, I put a dot of both light and dark rust close together to add a bit of interest. Once the dots were in place, I used a dry, flat brush in a downward stroke to create the streaks. I also applied some of this around the snowplows, but instead of a downward motion with the flat brush, I smeared it around a bit. That's why I left the plows until last. Depending on the prototype pictures, LLPX 1504 has a fair collection of grime streaks that seem to come and go depending upon the time of year. I decided to go with the middle ground, wanting to try out a new product, Engine Grime from Ammo by MIG. Applying this stuff is easy, but I wanted to keep it light. After giving the model a gloss coat following the rust streaks, I dampened the model with their own enamel thinner, and then took a small brush and did several downward strokes with the engine grime in places where it matched the prototype. Once this was done, I took a flat brush that was just barely dampened with the thinner and applied several downward strokes. It softened and extended the streaks just nicely. Once this step was done, I sprayed the model with a mix of 3 parts Future to 1 part flat base, as I wanted a very flat finish before doing the final steps. One of the small details that I wanted to cover on this was adding a little bit of a metallic to sheen to a few places. One of the ways of doing this is to take a graphite pencil and to shave it off onto a metallic surface, and then either using your finger or, in my case, a rubber-tipped brush to kind of massage into certain places. On this locomotive, I wanted to add a little bit to the old classification lights that aren't used anymore, as far as I'm aware, and also a little bit on the chains, and just to add a little bit of metallic detail just here and there. Not very much at all, but just enough. Using my airbrush, I lightly sprayed some Tamiya XF1 flat black around the exhaust stacks and then down the middle of the locomotive's top. Less is really more here. If you're tempted to add more, resist. You don't need a lot to give it that realistic touch. Before the last step, it was time to put the model back together. I put the number boards back in and then used a Micron pen to add the missing one from the number boards. I then put all of the glass back into the cab, assembled the shell, and then put it back onto the chassis. Now at this point, it really did look finished. However, much to my horror, I realized that on the rear number boards, I had actually put the numbers on upside down. Oh! I had taken a lot of time to make sure that the ones on the front were oriented the right way, only to make the exact mistake that I was afraid of on the rear. I wouldn't have time to fix this in order to release this video on time. However, mistakes like this keep one humble, and I will fix it at a later point. So onward to the next step. In the Weathering Basics video on dust, my go-to dust color is an even mix of Tamiya XF52 Buff and XF57 Flat Earth. However, for the Canadian Maritimes, the soil has a distinct reddish-brown color, particularly in the area that the Cape Breton Central Nova Scotia Railway operates. So I swapped out the flat earth for the redder NATO brown. I very lightly airbrushed this over the fuel tanks, the trucks, and the plows, and then made sure that the dust pattern on the sides of the locomotive were realistic for what would be stirred up. So here are some pictures of the end result. I still have to fix my mistakes with the rear number boards, and I would likely add a little bit more texture to the couplers. All told, this captures the character of the locomotive in the prototype pictures and will be a nice addition to my layout's branch line. As with any weathering project I do, there is always something that I learn in the process. And the big one for me this time around was to make sure that the numbers on the number boards are oriented properly before applying the decals. This is especially important if you are renumbering a locomotive. And even though mistakes happen, don't let that discourage you from moving forward and trying something new on your next project. Now, I hope you enjoyed this and found it helpful to see a start to finish process. So if you want more tips on how to get the most out of your weathering projects, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. Also, if you haven't done so already, check out the other videos on this channel, especially the Weathering Basics playlist. And so thanks for watching, and good luck, and may you keep on track.